If you have any questions about autonomy, you can check out our website, autonomy.work. I'll post a link in the chat. So we're ready to start. In recent weeks, we've seen a rise in anti-racist movements and reactionary racism. In today's event, titled Towards a Revolutionary Intercommunalism, we will be revisiting Huey Newton's theory of intercommunalism. Broadly speaking, what can we learn about the current moment from Huey Newton's analysis of imperialism? What do calls to take back control and protect statues tell us about the diminishing wages of whiteness? And how can we build on the legacies of the Black Panther Party survival programs to create intercommunal ways of living? So for today's discussion, we're joined by two brilliant speakers, Dr. John Narayan and Dr. Sita Balani. John is a lecturer in European and International Studies at King's College London. His recent research has focused on the understudied transnationalism of Black power and political theory created by groups such as the Black Panther Party. John has published the results of his research in journals such as Third World Quarterly, Theory, Culture and Society, Current Sociology, and the Sociological Review. Sita is a lecturer in contemporary literature and culture at King's College London. In her research and teaching, she explores the relationship between imperialism and identity in contemporary Britain. Her work has appeared in several publications, including Feminist Review, Identity Theory, the Journal of Postcolonial Writing, Open Democracy, and Tribune. So welcome to both of you, and thanks for taking the time for this event. Both John and Sita will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes to start us off, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation between the two speakers and also take some questions. So please send in your questions during the conversation. My friend Jackson Harms, who's in the chat, he's going to say hello, is going to be collating the questions for us, and I'll read them out at the end. So thanks for that help, Jax. Okay, I'm going to hand over to John now.
Cool. Can you make me a host?
Yes.
Is that doable?
There you go.
I am now the host. Cool. So I can share my screen. Hi, everyone. So hopefully you can all see this right now. All right. Can we see stuff? Does that do it? Yeah, cool. All right. Thanks, Ishan, for hosting this. Really, really cool to be here. And thanks, everyone, for coming. So what I'm going to do is just kind of outlay the kind of Huey P. Newton's theory of intercommunalism, which, of course, is being kind of understudied and not really kind of brought into the mainstream, but I think has a lot to talk about the current moment. And I thought I'd start with this picture of Huey Newton meeting Yasser Arafat because, you know, it's July the 1st and the West Bank annexation plan is not starting yet, but seems to be getting underway very soon. And I want to kind of bring this anti-imperial flavor to anti-racism. So, as you know, in the current moment, we're locked into this kind of, you know, we're in a moment of anti-racist struggle, specifically around anti-Blackness and around the cause of Black lives, both in the US and in the UK. Everyone's favorite statue hitting the water. And I want to kind of just say, well, how does Huey Newton's theory kind of speak to this current moment? So I know some of you may not know who Huey Newton was, what the Black Panther Party was. So I'll give you a brief little history and then we'll just run with the theory. So, and the reason we're doing this is, in a sense, this is a problem of how the left conceptualizes anti-racism, anti-imperialism, and its relationship to class struggle, right? So that's part of what we're trying to unpack today. All right, for those of you who don't know, the Black Panther Party is formed in 1966, predominantly as a kind of Black nationalist organization. Its primary kind of main goals are policing the police in Oakland, California. It's founded by a group of people, but predominantly the two men that would rise to kind of symbolize the party are Huey P. Newton on the right, on your right-hand side with a shotgun, and Bobby Seale, who would become the kind of iconary revolutionaries of the party, right? Inspired by Malcolm X, Mao, Fanon, Marx. Up until 1968, they're a kind of small organization, but after the assassination of Martin Luther King and the assassination of one of the first Black Panther Party members, Little Bobby Hutton, the Panthers become the kind of preeminent Black Power organization in America. So they become the kind of key key part of the Black Power era, which challenges the kind of idea that the civil rights movement is progressing, arguing for a kind of more radical solution to the kind of economic and social and political problems facing African Americans, but also linking that cause with the kind of rise of the third world, right? The rise of the third world project. Primarily, you'll often see the Panthers kind of brought into discussions around organizing within poorer working class African American neighborhoods, sometimes referred to as ghettos, kind of bringing together the urban dispossessed and using a kind of united group. But mainly when we come across the Panthers in kind of political theory or the idea of praxis, they're really normally reduced to just kind of gun-toting revolutionaries. And in a sense, part of what I've been trying to do is extract little bits of kind of correctives to that notion by saying, well, actually, there's a lot of really incredible political theory here and political praxis that we could draw upon, right? And quite famously, David Hilliard, who was the kind of chief of staff of the Black Panther Party, says something really interesting in his autobiography. He says, when it came to the left and the Panthers, and specifically Huey Newton, whose work I'm going to talk about, he says something else kind of fuels the left's criticism of Huey. They like us picking up guns and shooting it out with the pigs, but they don't want us as theoretical leaders. And part of what I've been trying to do is kind of bring the theoretical work of the Black Panther Party into kind of mainstream discussion around anti-racism, anti-imperialism, and class struggle. And just to show you some of the chops that you can come across in the Panther Party, if this works, there we go. So, like I said, kind of reduced armed struggle are things like this. So this is a copy of Immanuel Wallerstein's famous paper on the rise and future demise of the world capitalist system. It's what's known as world systems theory. And when I went to the Black Panther archives, and specifically Huey Newton's archive, what I found was that someone had sent Huey this document from 1972. And it reads on it, it says, "Dear Huey, the framework of this analysis is very close to yours. I think you might find it interesting," right? Which is really interesting because you wouldn't think that Huey Newton was a world systems theorist. But in a sense, someone had realized that the theory that was coming, this is a very famous paper by Immanuel Wallerstein, was actually very close to a theory Newton had already elucidated a year and a half previously. And what is that theory about, right? What is that? Well, let's just get back to the nuts and bolts of this. In 1970, Huey Newton exits prison and he turns up and he basically refocuses the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party had risen from 1968 from a citywide organization in Oakland to becoming a national organization with many chapters across the US. Huey Newton ends up in prison on murder charges in 1968, leaves prison, comes out in 1970, and the Panthers are under attack by the US state. The counterintelligence program led by the FBI has infiltrated the Panthers, created conflicts, also assassinated Panthers across the country. And in a sense, he comes to a national organization in 1970 when he's let out of prison in August 1970, which is in turmoil. He re-articulates the Panthers' approach from confronting the state with, say, armed means into what will be community organization work. And the reason he does part of this is this theory of intercommunalism. So intercommunalism is first articulated by Newton at Boston College in 1970. And what it does is to theorize imperialism and the changes in the global economy and to root the Black liberation struggle within it. And his basic premise is this, and we can run over more of the kind of nuts and bolts of this in a QA, which is the US now, post-war, is the dominant force in the world, but it isn't a nation state anymore, it's an empire. Its corporations and its ability to traverse the globe with finance, also with its military might, means that every country and every community in the world is essentially underpinned under American empire. And in Newton's ideas, global capital is going to spread out across the world. Technological innovation will draw the world closer together, and this will be what he calls empire. Empire will then, in Newton's ideas, lead to the end of kind of national states having real power, because they'll be dominated by finance capital. And the kind of idea of the non-state that most of us as leftists or communists dream of will actually be ushered in by capital rather than the people. Why is this important? Well, for Newton, reactionary intercommunalism, and that's just what he calls this process, which is what you and I call globalization or neoliberal globalization. He's basically talking about the same thing, where corporations dominate the globe and draw countries together in terms of production. And he argues that production will move from the global north to the global south. Industrial production will move from the global north to the global south. And the ideologies of markets and consumption will start to overrun even the socialist countries in the 1970s. This includes the USSR, which he predicts will fall. And basically not many people were making these predictions in the early 70s. China and other countries, where he basically says, Newton's argument is, they'll not be able to fight this off. And what he starts to then argue is two main things happen. The differences in the degree between the first and the third world will start to shift slightly. You'll start to find elements of third world poverty in the first world and start to find elements of first world wealth in the third world, right? Also key to this will be the colonial boomerang. Newton's ideas about the kind of what we call disarticulated Fordism, the movement of production from the global north to the global south, will lead to shattering of the racial settlements of post-war welfare states. So most welfare states that were created in advanced economies, such as the US and the UK, largely were racially underpinned, right? There was an element of providing jobs for white workers, with those institutions of welfare seen as white, slightly playing out different in the US, where there isn't so much of a defined welfare state. But Newton's key argument is, once stable jobs, stable employment, and is eradicated by two things. One, the moving of production to the global south, but also automation, which will get rid of lots of jobs, specifically for white industrial workers, but increasingly white middle-class workers as well. His argument is that the racial settlement, what we could call the wages of whiteness, will start to disappear for large bits of the populations in the US and other advanced economies in Europe. And that this colonial boomerang will kind of shatter the racial settlement that kind of underpinned 1945 to 1970. What does that then mean for us? Well, Newton then tries to say, well, we can bring the common cause against anti-racism together in the US, together with a kind of anti-imperial force, which is happening across the rest of the world. This is Newton meeting the Premier of China in 1972, and later on meeting Yasser Arafat around the Palestinian cause. And his argument is this: if you want to eradicate this kind of new global phenomena, then anti-racism will be key to that, because many of the conditions that are going to happen to the majority of advanced economies already exist in the third world, and they already exist in the poor, impoverished African-American and other migrant communities in the US. So those conditions will become the norm for the majority of these societies. And so you can think, we'll talk about this later, but you can think about that today. If you think about where precarious work is, where who's going to get automated first is, they exist within migrant communities. They exist within racialized communities. The one thing I want to stress is that Newton has a plan that, you know, we could all link together. We could all link together against this. He calls it liberated territories. He starts saying the struggle for Black liberation in the US could link up with struggles in the third world, could link up with the Palestinian struggle, could all do solidarity, and we could fight empire and create liberated territory. But like any good leftist, it's never that rosy. And what he then starts to say is, but there's big problems with this, because as contemporary reactionary intercommunalism transpires, what you and I call globalization happens, actually the people become fractured, right? Because the institutions that bind us together, like unions, like the education, like the nation state, they start to fall apart. And we'll actually become antagonistic to each other, and solidarity will fall apart because there'll be a big racial fissure as the white elements of society can no longer draw on the wages of whiteness that had underpinned kind of welfare capitalism. but also because we'll start turning on each other. And he has a great example of this. The Panthers offered to send troops to Vietnam at one point to really pee the American state off. But the African American community, elements of them, write to Newton and say, why are you giving our blood to the Vietnamese cause? I thought the party was for us. And Newton's argument is we need to embed ourselves in communities to actually create that forms of solidarity. And what they start to do from the late 60s onwards is create community programs. Community programs that do two things. They start to save people materially. So as the US state couldn't feed young African Americans or even poor working class communities in the US, the Panthers created breakfast programs that would help feed young children. And there were other programs from the Panthers run free medical clinics where healthcare was free busing programs for people who had incarcerated relatives. There was even a plumbing program. These were based in poor African-American communities where the party basically provided these services. But what Newton was also trying to do via these programs was to organize the people. So at these breakfast meals, for example, Black history would be taught, and people would be told about imperialism. They were trying to not only materially save the people, but also organize the people to create what we could see as, if we wanted to use kind of contemporary Marxist language, as a kind of Gramscian war of position against empire, to kind of create a kind of counter-hegemonic forms of institutions, intercommunal institutions, which dealt with material issues, but also created ideological sense of solidarity. Now, of course, part of this also was a big sense of anti-capitalism. Everything was largely provided for free, right? Free breakfast programs, free medical care. And there was an attempt to kind of really challenge the kind of commodification of life that was happening under capitalism. And why is this important? Well, Newton thought this was important because of this. Because of the current changes, he didn't think that people would understand how they could actually deal with their oppressors. And this is a quote I have, actually. It's from Elaine Brown and a conversation between Huey Newton, where they basically say, I'm not going to read it out, but it basically is like saying, we can't ideologically assault the point of production anymore because the jobs have either been gone or they're automated. But what we can do is organize the people, because we no longer can really see where we should be struggling, right? That's a big thing for the Panthers. And why is this important? Well, I'm just going to briefly end up on this and we can pull all of this out in the discussion. This is probably the most famous graph of the early 20th century. It's known as the elephant graph. Yeah, if you squint at it long enough, you'll see that it looks like an elephant. Maybe, slightly. Sita's not convinced. And basically, it shows you the real increase in income distribution across the planet, from the poorest 0% to the richest 1%. And what you'll see here is all of us who live in advanced economies are between the 75th and 85th percentile. Those of us who are not billionaires or millionaires on this call. There may be some here, I don't know. And you'll see that our incomes have not increased too much. And what's happened is the stagnation that has accompanied neoliberal globalization in advanced economies has largely played out like Newton thought. It's been fractured along racialized nativist lines, where people have blamed everyone but the clauses of global capitalism for the failure of things. So anti-immigration narratives, the re-emergence of real far-right fascism in the White House as well, can largely be explained, if in a rough way, by the processes Newton would put into thing. And then when I teach this, I always say the trunk explains Trump, all right? So, and we can pull that out. Why is this important today? Well, in some ways, we're back in this current moment, aren't we, of this playing out. We have our fascist leader of the free world, but against him, as we saw earlier, we maybe have intercommunal forms of solidarity happening in the US, which were pushing back against this neo-fascism, right? And we can pull out a discussion about whether that's intercommunalism. And we also have this in the UK with our Prime Minister, virile as he is, doing push-ups. one of my favorite academics said that she was giving up push-ups on Twitter because of this. I don't know if anyone saw that. But why is this important? Because and I'll just end with this. I think we need to go back to Newton and the idea of intercommunalism, because in a sense, the current crisis, crises, which are linked between the emergence of a kind of movement against anti-Black racism with the COVID-19 crisis, which is showing us all of the contradictions of capitalism, and also all of the contradictions of racial capitalism, in a sense, have to be brought together. And I know people may not be happy with me saying that, because they'll say that I'm diminishing one struggle for another. But I feel if Huey Newton was here, he would be saying very similar things about how can we bring our struggles into conversation with each other? How can we create intercommunal forms of solidarity that will allow us to create liberated forms of territory and institutions that will allow us all to be liberated, right? And I'll just end with this quote. And I feel like this is where we're at. Revolution is not an action, it is a process. And in many ways, I feel like the current moment asks us to think dialectically about how we can push that process forward. All right, and I'll kick over to Sita. If I just stop sharing, hold on. There we go. And then if I ask Sita to unmute.
All right. Okay, cool. Thanks so much to Ishan at Autonomy for the invitation. And thanks, John, for that really brilliant introduction. Me and John work in the same building, but very rarely manage to see each other at work. But it's nice to hear you talk about that, and to imagine you doing that in the classroom. I think the students are lucky to get that kind of introduction. So I want to begin by kind of echoing some of what's already been said, which is that we live in very weird times in which the most reactionary and the most revolutionary ideas circulate at tremendous speed in the digisphere on social and timeline media. So we have a movement to abolish the police. This idea of abolition has been suddenly kind of moved from this quite marginal idea to something that's spoken about in much more mainstream locations. And we also have a movement towards turning all states into police states, it seems. So we have a movement towards community self-determination and a movement towards authoritarian nationalism. I think these divergent, opposing conceptions of the world, what's interesting is that they've always existed, but at the moment we're seeing them cross over multiple times in any given moment, in any given context. I think Newton's work anticipates some elements of the strange, fractured, and highly interconnected world we currently inhabit. So we're seeing a convergence on the right of neo-fascist authoritarian formations. So we can see that in the UK, in India, in the USA, in Israel, in Brazil, in Hungary, in the Philippines, and elsewhere. I think it's important to try and capture some of that global reach there. And those are political formations that seem to have, or might appear to have, a set of isolationist tendencies. So they sometimes talk in a quite protectionist, isolationist manner. But in fact, what we're really seeing them do is accelerate and deepen the extractivist and highly exploitative global regime that was intensified by the neoliberal economic order that Newton prophesies. So though there might be some rhetoric in a different direction, actually what we're seeing is really in many ways more of the same. But at the same time, we're seeing a global movement against racism, and to some degree, I think, against nationalism. So I think to a less significant degree, and one that perhaps we need to think through more carefully. Now, I haven't framed this, or I'm not framing this as a movement against the neo-fascist authoritarian order, because I actually think it's the culmination of a much longer tradition, a much deeper set of events than the ones that we've seen in the last few years. But I think what we're seeing is these tendencies coming together in this moment of the global pandemic. So if this was a TV drama or a novel, I think we would say that there was too much going on. I think we would say there was too much plot, there were too many characters, that it was pushing at the edges of being believable. But that is the situation we find ourselves in. And that quotation from Antonio Gramsci that people quote all the time has been going around in my head, where he says, I'll misquote it slightly, but he says, "The old world is dying and the new cannot yet be born, and in this interregnum a variety of morbid symptoms appear." So I feel some temptation to think of all of this, of the too much going on, as those morbid symptoms. But I've also been saying that quotation for my whole adult life, so the sense in which it's uniquely relevant now might not be justifiable. But nonetheless, I think it's a useful set of images, even if it doesn't totally describe the situation we live in. So we don't know if this is an interregnum, but I think we all have the sense of these fractures, of the kind of peculiar temporality that we currently live in. But I think Newton can help us kind of unpack some of this. I think this idea of reactionary intercommunalism starts to chip away at some of what we're seeing. And one of the dynamics that Newton anticipates is state capture by corporations. And I think we can see this in really palpable terms in the UK's murderous mismanagement of the COVID-19 crisis. So just to take one aspect of that, but I think a really crucial one, everyone thinks a really crucial one really, which is contact tracing. So that's been outsourced to Serco, which is a company that was recently obliged to pay the government a massive fine for fraud on a previous unrelated contract. So this is an organisation that has committed fraud on a contract given to it by the UK government, and which has now been given another contract, in this case awarded in a secretive procurement process, so that's not information that's available to the public, and they're being paid £108 million. That's how much the contract is worth. A leaked email from Serco's chief executive recently said that the company wants to use this contract to, quote, cement the position of the private sector in the NHS, end quote. So what we're seeing there is a kind of state capture by corporations against the backdrop of every bit of public health advice that says that contact tracing should not be organised in this fashion. The contact tracing would be better done through the already existing networks of NHS primary care trusts. But what's happening here is that a form of outsourcing that the UK state has been enamoured with for 2 decades now is no longer capable, or does no longer desire seeing the possibility of organising social and economic life outside of that. And we've seen that outsourcing on this scale was really trialled in the border regime. So you can look at companies like G4S, Serco, who now do the contact tracing, and others, as kind of forerunners of mopping up these contracts. And now we see the same logic of competition, of market competition across all elements of public life. So domestic violence services are also organised through the same process. A local council, for example, will put a contract out to tender. Different services will bid for that contract, and the cheapest will get the gig. And so that's one of the reasons that something like women's services or domestic violence services become increasingly unspecialised, and it becomes increasingly difficult to do those kind of specialist services. So start to see how this logic of marketisation, of outsourcing, is now the kind of central way in which the British state is organised. And so in trialling that on the border regime, first we see a kind of process of trialling things on racialised populations with the aim of extending to all. So again, that's something, a dynamic, a frame that we see in Newton, who also anticipates these dynamics of state capture by corporations. And I think simultaneously, we're also seeing the roles of corporations in co-opting struggles against capitalism. And the Black Panther Party, one of the first political organisations, I think, to have that intensely seductive aesthetic that brands were keen to capitalise on, and which they continue to capitalise on. So I think those images that you showed, John, are really what most people know of the BPP, right? They're what most people imagine. And in fact, I think there's a general kind of haziness around the multiple organisations of the Black Power movement and their distinctions and the ways in which they fought with each other, the more nationalist and the less nationalist tendencies. And, you know, some of this plays out on timeline media, on Twitter in particular, about these fights about, you know, what did it all really mean and who gets to determine the true politics of Black power. So perhaps that's something we can pick up in a bit. But what we've seen is a kind of new iteration of that dynamic of co-optation, or an attempt to co-opt. We've seen that in a global outpouring of support from corporations for Black Lives Matter. I'm just going to read out a few examples, but you'll have seen many, many more. So these will just be a kind of little handful. So Uber have said that they stand in solidarity with the Black community. Ben & Jerry's has said it wants to dismantle white supremacy. Unilever, who own Ben & Jerry's, have declared that they have a responsibility for racial justice. For some reason, responsibility and racial justice are in capital letters. Nike say they believe in a level playing field for all, and Adidas assure us at the end of their long BLM statement that this is just the start. Now, there's an obvious contradiction between word and deed here, because Uber refuses to classify its drivers, who are overwhelmingly Black and brown men around the world, as employees, systematically denying them access to benefits or sick pay. So Vermont's migrant dairy workers put in 80-hour weeks under constant fear of arrest and deportation, and the milk produced by these dairy workers is the milk used for Ben & Jerry's ice cream. Unilever effectively bought the Royal Niger Company, which was instrumental in establishing British colonial governance in the region. And workers in Indonesian garment factories sew Nike and Adidas clothes for as little as €86 a month. So we've got this contradiction here. And this is the kind of global landscape into which we have to understand the current moment in Britain, one where the power of corporations in capturing the state is really massive and really significant, but their social and cultural power is also extraordinary. So brands spent all of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s trying to construct themselves as people, right? They spent decades, endless money on PR companies and marketing research and hiring graduates from all sorts of liberal arts and English lit and art history programs to try and work out how they could construct themselves in the public imagination as people, as individuals, as being like kind of cuddly Teddy or being like someone you know, right? So we've got Ronald McDonald, or we've got the Coca-Cola Santa Claus. We've got all these things that are about trying to make corporations the fundamentals of public life. So that's the global landscape. And it has a particular flavour in Britain, I think, as the old heart of empire having its, what we hope might be its final deathly convulsions. So we've got state capture by corporations who've gutted the public sector for profit and in whose interests the state is run. So that's what we've seen with Serco winning that contract. That contact tracing is done in the interests of Serco, not in the interests of public health. And then we've also got this outpouring of support for Black Lives Matter by all sorts of actors who work tirelessly to create a world in which Black lives are devalued, something like Uber, right? So I think it's also worth stating that these corporations, as John's introduction suggests, also like immiserate and lumpenize large sections of white workers. So Uber's a great example, not least because it is both automation and it is the moving of who does the work, right? So we're seeing this kind of shifts there. So I think that's the kind of wider frame through which I've tried to sort of translate some of what Huey Newton lays out into the kind of current moment. I wanted to finish by showing an image. I wondered if, Ishan, if you could put that on the screen for me. Amazing, thank you. Okay, so this is an image from a couple of weeks ago that some of you might have seen circulating. It is a photograph of cement protecting, I use that term in quotation marks, the statue of George Eliot in Nuneaton in the Midlands. So George Eliot, for those of you who don't know, was the pen name of Mary Ann Evans, the Victorian novelist who wrote Daniel Deronda and Middlemarch, long, chunky Victorian novels. And this was, of course, an image from the weekend after the statue of Edward Colston was toppled by protesters at the Black Lives Matter march in Bristol. So Edward Colston, as everyone now knows, if you didn't before, was a slave trader, and there had been numerous campaigns in Bristol to have his statue removed. In the absence of these campaigns bearing fruit, the people of Bristol removed it themselves. There's only so long people could spend, I think, signing petitions before they decide they might have to take matters into their own hands. Now, there are no comparable campaigns in Nuneaton, as far as I can tell, to remove the statue of George Eliot. So maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, John. I know you live in that general direction. But I don't think anyone in Nuneaton is making a big kind of concerted effort to have this statue taken down. Incidentally, George Eliot was a supporter of the movement for the abolition of slavery. Now, the temptation here is, of course, to mock these men, and maybe we can do that in the Q&A, but I think we need to also take a minute to ask, how did they end up there? So why did this group of white men in Britain in the middle of a pandemic in the year 2020 find themselves spending a drizzly Sunday defending a statue of a 19th century novelist from hordes of anti-racist protesters that were never going to show up? What is it they thought they were defending? What is it they thought they were doing there? And my sense is that they were there to defend racial hierarchy, that they were there to defend a global and a national system of racial hierarchy. Because I think that what's happening is that there's an experience in Britain at the moment among a significant section of the population. There's an experience of the Black Lives Matter movement as an attempt to diminish the wages of whiteness. So this is the term taken from Du Bois, extended by David Roediger, that refers, as John mentioned, to the public psychological wage offered to white workers to prevent them from viewing their struggle as aligned with their Black or otherwise racialized counterparts. And my sense here is that the return to street-based fascism in recent years, which is becoming more intense by the week, it feels like, is partly a response to the ruptures of global capitalism, the immiseration, the attacks on working conditions, and so on, combined with the massive retreat of the state in Britain and the capture of what's left of the welfare state and what's left of public life by corporations. Now, there's a kind of right-wing version of this story that tells you that these are the white working class, which I think is a term that we should always see as a big red flag. It's a big, dangerous sign that we should be like, hold on, what's going on here? But there's a story that goes that the white working class has been abandoned, been left behind by neoliberal globalization. Now, what this story hides is that the working class is multiracial, as Huey P. Newton starts to lay out. Huey P. Newton also helpfully, I think, shows us that the very wealthy are also at this point multiracial too. And so it's not that the white working class have been left behind by globalization and that the Black or brown working class have somehow found themselves on the ascendancy under these dynamics. Like, this is the kind of fiction, right? That's the story. It's a sort of retelling of Enoch Powell there in a way. That's not what I'm suggesting, so I'm just going to be super clear about that. But I am suggesting that the diminishing wages of whiteness are being made to do an incredible amount of work in what John refers to as the absence of actual wages, right? So real living standards have fallen dramatically. And so the ideological work that needs to be done by this idea of whiteness, by this idea that Britain is still great, by this idea that the white working man is still the subject of national life, that work has to do a tremendous amount of work. And so I think that the fact that what we're seeing is the ascendancy of another vision for a national or indeed global order that doesn't operate according to this racial schema is one of the reasons that we're seeing these morbid symptoms appear. So these absurd statements of support for Black Lives Matter, while I don't know how much impact they're going to have on the movement for Black Lives, I don't know how much impact they're going to have on anti-racist movements. Like, they might have some immobilizing impact. My sense is that a significant number of people are now a little savvier than that and are not so convinced by the kind of empty words of even Ben and Jerry's. So they might not be successfully co-opting that. But I think these statements might be shifting the psychological and social terrain of the far right. So I think that's one of the effects, one of the kind of peculiar contradictory effects of this outpouring of support. And I think that's an effect that the Huey P. Newton's ideas help us to kind of sensitize ourselves to, help us to kind of see the kind of contradictory outcomes of pushes in different directions. So I think that dialectical method helps us there. I'm going to hand back over to John to kind of get us into a more open chat.
There you go. I thought Ishan had to unmute me. No, that is amazing. Thank you, Sita. I think that's absolutely amazing. I'm really, that's where we are, right? Like, we're trying to bring the two sections together. I guess the first question to get at, I guess, is, and taking a lead from what you were talking about in terms of whiteness, right? Like, and one of the things where I wrote a paper about this like 3 or 4 years ago when Trump first won, and I'm not sure that whiteness can get the job done, right? Like I feel like it can certainly could get Trump reelected, and it's definitely got Boris in and all this stuff, but the global order is not. And I get in trouble when I say this, but I don't think white supremacy runs the world anymore. I think you're going to see the 21st century will be Asian of some description centered in a capitalist economy. Not that these are great things, by the way, right? Like, so I'm not valorizing China or India. I'm just saying, in terms of white supremacy, and the best thing that white supremacy was really good at was it never allowed minorities to do capitalism, because Lord knows brown, black people understand that many of us are very good at it, right? And no, I wrote in the paper in another issue thing that the natives have gone native when it comes to capitalism, right? And they're very good at it, and but they're immiserating large bits of the globe. So can whiteness actually get the job done anymore in the long term? So short term, yeah. But what do we think? Like, does the movement for Black Lives, which has seen multiracial organization, spearheaded by African Americans, obviously in the US, but when you look at the people on the streets, it is a multi-ethnic groupings on the street. Similarly in the UK. So my question is, does whiteness get the job done anymore? What do you think? And I think you've got to unmute yourself.
Thank you. So I think that kind of what we're seeing at the moment is interesting, because we're seeing a large number of people around the world, but in this country specifically, align themselves with Black Lives Matter. Not necessarily people that would have done otherwise. And so I think it's interesting that people think it would be uniquely bad for their brand to not align themselves with that. So we've seen universities align themselves with that. I mean, we've seen police forces align themselves with Black Lives Matter. Kind of fantastically weird situation. And so what we're seeing there, I think, is what happens when a significant number of people don't find the claim of whiteness in the form of the people defending the statues compelling, right? There's a kind of cultural logic at work here, where people are saying, I don't really want to associate myself with that. I don't want that to speak for me. And one of the problems with that here has been that that's been centered around Brexit, right? So that's been where the fracture happened. And then that got re-narrated as a question around sovereignty and freedom and so on, in which actually that re-narration of a kind of beleaguered white nativeness was very effective. But I think what we're seeing now is the thinness of that story come through. So on a national level, the work that has to be done to get that job done, for like the idea of a kind of white English identity, it seems to me to be having some kind of diminishing returns. And I'm not sure how much work the kind of Boris buffoonery can do in the face of mass death and immiseration and huge unemployment and the most significant contraction economically we've seen in however long. Globally, I think we're looking at something a little bit different, in which I don't know that form of racial order has been the organizing principle for a while now, right? So I think that a kind of multi-ethnic elite run the world in a much more significant way than 100 years ago, and that in some ways there are kind of multiple centers of power in that, right? So in some ways there is an anticipation of an anti-colonial order of multiplicity, of a multiverse, but it is of course much more kind of financially integrated than that. But you see there's multiple spots in which power emanates. So I think that's already started to diminish. I think one of the questions is what happens to the nationalist convulsions that have appeared in the wake of that. So I wonder, yeah, what do you think in response to that?
Well, I mean, my take 3 or 4 years ago was that the inevitability was war, right? Like that you would get, and you're seeing this. I mean, we are seeing elements of this happen. If you look at the US kind of China proxy conflicts that are happening, I mean, and look at what happened on the Indian-China border just a few weeks ago, where I don't know if everyone knows this, India and China share a border, which they went to war over in, I think it's 1967, and they demilitarized it. So there's no weapons there, but their troops regularly come into contact. And 2 weeks ago, I think there were 600 people involved in a brawl with steel bars and anything else people get their hands on. And this actually is a proxy for US-China conflict, because the India sits in its nationalist crazy Hindutva moment as a US ally, right? And you've seen stuff happening in the South China Sea. So, I mean, I'm actually just always really interested about whether whiteness gets the job done maybe electorally, but is the world, and that's why Brexit just doesn't make any sense to me, because whether you like it or not, the 21st century will be centered in a capitalist way in Asia, right? That's not a great thing, because there's still the extraction that's happening in Africa, right? Mm-hmm. And we know the extractive resources are coming out there. We know the immiseration of the global commodity chain that then runs to Foxconn or garment workers in Bangalore. We know that. So, but I just think that the whiteness thing can only end really badly for everybody, right? I don't see how it ends well. That's my take on that.
Right.
Yeah. But I mean, and then the flip on that is, can we get do movements around prison abolition offer us the potential to rebuild our societies in different ways?
So one of the things that I think that the movement around the kind of centering this around prisons, policing, militarization, rather than around the politics of work, one of the things that allows for the possibility of is for that vision of a kind of lumpen proletariat, a dispossessed as the agent, which is obviously what Newton kind of prophesies and what he says that Marx didn't foresee. And I think that that's one of the things that we're seeing here, right, is a refusal of the terms of dispossession, a refusal of the logic of dispossession that offers something, I think, that it couldn't have done at a moment of Western industrial power. Because actually what we're seeing is what happens when capital flees. And what's all that's left of service jobs, all that's left are call centres. I think all of this happening at a moment in which even something like retail is totally screwed. We're going to see like the kinds of like boarded up high streets we saw as austerity started to bite. We're going to see in a much more intense way now, and the kind of the concentration of power in the hands of something like Amazon is really extraordinary. And so I think that what abolition offers is a vision of social change that doesn't take work as its central coordinate, because it acknowledges that being out of work or being in really shit ununionized work is actually a more common experience, and one that might have some capacity to unite people globally.
Mm-hmm. No,
sorry.
Go on, Isha.
Sorry, I was just going to interject because we have some questions, and it's one of them is related to the discussion that you brought in, John, about does whiteness do the job. So this is also, I'm going to adjust the question slightly because the person who asked said I could, and because I've been reading about the history of racialization through Cedric Robinson's work, for instance. And what I'm wondering is whether when we say whiteness is not going to do the job anymore, it's not going to get the job done, I'm guessing we're saying the racialization might still be present. So the question that was asked was about, can whiteness be appropriated or remapped into new geographies? And I sort of see that as racialization. I'm thinking here of the perverse logics of decoloniality being used in India to advance Hindu nationalist agenda. So this was asked by Nabila Ahmed from Sheffield.
Ooh. Am I the only one that's not hearing that properly? Maybe that.
think Sita, can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, do you want to go first? I think John's cut off slightly.
Yeah, I think we're going to see so Cedric Robertson, who Isham just referenced. Part of his argument is that racialization begins in Europe and is then exported outwards. So it doesn't happen in the encounter between the European and the non-European other. It happens within Europe and is exported outwards. So there's always been the process in medieval Europe and pre-existing that of racialization that then comes to inform how capitalist development is instated globally through the mechanism of racialization. Now, the fact that it's begun in Europe and been exported does not mean that Europeans have the monopoly over racialization. It might indeed be fortunate if they did, but they don't. So what we have seen is the logic of racialization can be taken up elsewhere. And so absolutely in India, we can see that, I mean, that works with dynamics. It works with the fractures of caste and religion that pre-exist the European imposition of racialization, but that are nonetheless retooled by the logic of race, that are retooled by the structures of nationalism. So the nation state as a form offers some unique opportunities for violence, for dispossession. And that's one of the things that I think we can see in how Hindu nationalist India is playing out.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah, can you guys hear me? Yeah, cool. Yeah, no, I think Cedric Robinson's work is key here. I would shift it like this. I mean, that capital, the link between whiteness and capital was convenient, and I think also has shifted slightly, like Sita's saying. So you get these other kind of now emergent capitalist powers that, I mean, look, Hindu nationalism has elements of white supremacy in it, encoded with caste as well. Is it about whiteness? You know, that's a Twitter debate, isn't it? That really is a Twitter debate. I would just get back to this point where I would say the movements towards, say, prison abolition really offer a way in now for everyone to get on board a project that necessarily may have to be pushed beyond even about. So look at the US and look at the UK. The primary kind of what they're pushing at is, can we stop police violence against Black people, which is a really legitimate point of struggle, right? It's what it is it does the work of organizing really well because it can bring people into that struggle. But abolition, if it's not to be reformed, has to then say, well, what are the reasons that we have this prison system, right? What is the reason that we have a police force? In the US, the budgets are crazy. In the UK, they tell you that the budget has been really cut, but actually the budget of policing is now at 2000 levels, and there's still a lot of police out there, right? Like, I know it may not feel like that, but there are a lot of police out there doing some quite bad things, as we keep seeing in stories. And I think what abolition then opens is, well, how can we reimagine our institutions? And that will automatically, I think, destabilize these kind of white institutions as well, if that makes sense. I feel like that, I want to get too gloomy because I want to be happy. I feel like this is a good moment of whiteness being slightly, dislodged, because we're going to have to start thinking about, if we really are into this idea that Black lives matter in our societies, that's entwined not just with the police force, right? That's entwined with all of the other institutions that have been anti-Black, but also are linked up to the global commodity chain.
Okay, I think we've got one more question which relates to resistance, perhaps, and one is a bit more upbeat. So this question is from Will. It seems like the Panther community organizing was in part about institution building against profit-driven alternatives, thereby decommodifying certain basic functions. So what do you guys think about the potential for rehabilitating similar schemes today for strategy change? Should community activists be thinking about setting up these sort of networks? We may have seen this in the mutual aid networks that have set up. Is there potential there for these becoming sources of organizing the newly unemployed? because in Britain right now we're seeing at least the claimant rate is at 12%, something like 11%. I think last month we reported this.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that that 10-point that program, the Survival Pending Revolution program that the Panthers instated, was that it socialized reproductive functions. So it didn't just decommodify things, it specifically decommodified work that was often considered to be women's work, that was often unpaid, but also individuated or privatized within the nuclear family. And so by making that work collective, a certain form of community building was made possible because it refused the logic of that privatized nuclear family, right? So something like breakfast clubs or going to visit a family member in prison, that's work done predominantly by women and predominantly unpaid. That was unpaid when the Panthers did it as well. They notoriously referred to themselves as the ox of the movement. They said they would work, they would labor for free for the movement. And it's interesting to think about that now, I think, because we now live in this age where everyone's like, pay me all the time. Like, I tweeted something, pay me, I had a thought, pay me. And there's, I think, problems with that, but I'm not totally sure that the Panther alternative was super effective and ended up being quite violent, particularly because it did remain women that did a significant amount of this work. So the attempt to decommodify that work was then largely women continued to shoulder that feminized labor. But I think that tells us something, right, about what is at stake in these massively high levels of unemployment and where we might begin to imagine alternatives. So when the cuts started kicking in 2010, there was this real reticence among the left about taking on that work of like holding society together, of food banks and soup kitchens and homeless shelters and all that stuff. Like, we were all like, no, that's the state's job. We have to get the state to keep paying for this shit, because if that's not our job, and if we start doing that, the state will never do it again. And now we've been left in a situation where we do that or no one does it. We do that or we see hundreds of thousands of deaths like on the recs, and we're going to keep seeing that because that's what we saw under austerity. And so I think that rather than start from a position of trying to kind of pick up that plan from the US in the 60s and kind of re-import it here, instead, actually what we need to do is start to think about the work that's already been being done there and try and reimagine it as spaces not only of survival, but of a kind of building of a set of alternatives, without assuming when we go in that we know what those alternatives are. So one of the problems is the left really loves to go and do things like this as a kind of so that you can do the survival stuff and then you do the ideological work, and like that's a really nice idea, but it basically never works, because you have to go and work with people and build new ideological projects together. There is no shortcut to that. No one wants to like watch your lefty film after they've had your free meal as a form of a lecture. Like, no one's into that. So there has to be a kind of possibility here, I think, of going in to do that work with a kind of humbleness, without knowing what will come out of it.
John, I think you're still muted. Hang on.
No, I'm good. There we go. No, I agree, and I think like that has to be the key crux of this, is that how do we learn from the past? And one of the things I've always said is that actually these survival programs probably would best be rolled out in really poor white neighborhoods in the Red Wall, right? Because we could do with some of that ideological retraining via someone's problems. Kind of, I feel like we will be forced to do more of this stuff, because as the unemployment rate jumps up, it's not just that we're going to have an unemployment rate that jumps up. It's just, I'll give you one example. It's twigged in a lot of employers' heads now, whether for good or worse, that lots of people can work from home. And I don't think everyone, if and when we solve the the current pandemic crisis with a vaccine or whatever it is, or just maybe enough of us die that it's safe now to go back out, because that seems to be the government's plan, right? Kill all the vulnerable people off. I'm not sure everyone's going to return to work in the same way they did. And I think that brings up issues in itself, because as an academic, the ability to work from home is not as great as it seems. Right? As anyone knows who's replied to an email at like 11:50 at night. Stupidly, but we do these things. And so I think lots of things will be, I don't think the unemployment rate will just suddenly drop down and we'll all go back to having, lunch breaks with coffees and teas. I think there's going to be large scale scarring of the economy. And then it will be, well, what will the state provide for you? And actually, we've seen glimmers that the state could provide a lot more than it did in the last 10 years. So in the last 3 months, we've seen the magic, creation of money. Just literally, for 10 years, we were told there was no money. We were told there was nothing that could be done for us. And literally, we see it created overnight. So I feel like the organizations that we could do in communities, which will need organizing, part of that will be, look, I have a lefty weird dream that we would do this thing called communism, and we could have a whole different thing about that, right? Like, that's my dream. But before we get there, we have to get to steps of people getting together and organizing in ways that their lives are made much more better than they currently are. And I think the movement for Black Lives has got people locked into like specific things that you could do to make things better. And we're going to need more of that in the coronavirus crisis as well, because we're going to have to start saying, oh, hold on, the state used to do this in the early noughties. It's not been doing this for 10 years, and now we need it to do it again. But we don't want a private company doing it, right? I think we're going to have to start thinking about issues like that. Like what happens when a service needs to be resumed, but we don't want it, we just don't want to. It's a bit like the financial crisis. We don't want to rewind back to February, just like we don't want to rewind back to pre-2008. So we have to have different visions about what our communities will look like post-wing. And I think part of the community organizing that the Panthers did will be pretty good ways of finding out how we could reorientate our societies. I'll give you what's the last example. There was a government advert today about the need to stay alert, yeah? And in it, they showed a shot and they were like, some of us will need to work at home. And they showed a woman holding a baby while she was on the computer. God, honestly, I'll put it on Twitter later, Sita, because it's so wonderfully truthful, but at the same time so wrong that you're like, and it will be, how do we rethink our societies community-wise? Listen, women have borne the brunt, specifically BME women have borne the brunt of the coronavirus, because they've not only had to keep working, but they've also had to do childcare and all of the feminized labor. Well, part of the post-corona world must be that we reorientate ideas of the kind of burdens that we place on women, right? Like, we're going to have to do that. And I think community organizing in the current ways is doing. Last point, I'm not sure that what we're doing in mutual aid is what technically the Panthers were doing, because and whether we like it or not, the Panthers in cities were organized groups providing kind of mass service to various communities. And lots of us are actually, it's not survival pending revolution, we're just surviving. So I just point that out.
I come in quickly. Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think that the idea that there's an inherent left-wing consciousness to picking up your neighbours shopping for them needs to be rethought. This is a kind of fantasy that the left has always had, that being nice is a distinctly or uniquely left-wing quality, and it's really not. So I grew up in like a small village somewhere. Everyone is incredibly right-wing, but no one leaves old ladies without their shopping. Do you get me? Like, that's not how it works. And most of the world doesn't work that way. People do look out for each other, and then they go and vote for Boris Johnson. Like, that's a reality that the left has to contend with. So we don't have the monopoly on being nice guys in a kind of everyday neighbourly way. But I do think what the mutual aid groups showed is that the response to crisis is not individualization. That actually almost no one responds to crisis. Very few people respond to crisis by pulling the bridge up. The only people that do that have literal bridges to their houses. Like the only people that do that are like the incredibly wealthy. Actually, the vast majority of people wanted to connect with other people. Like those WhatsApp groups on a neighborhood level filled up immediately. And I think what that shows us is actually the limit of that kind of neoliberal ideology. It actually shows us the limits at which people can think of themselves as alone, as singular. So we don't have a left-wing consciousness being built in those mutual aid groups, but we might be building a consciousness that the kind of psychic structures in neoliberalism are insufficient. And the other thing that I think these groups might have shown in the fact that as soon as they sprung up, which they did in this kind of extraordinary way, I think, just at the level of like pace and volume, as soon as that happened, the government set up their NHS responders app, which was, it was kind of like the kind of thing that Silicon Valley used to do, where they'd come up with an idea that was like a non-idea, you know, like an app that sent all of your friends a message to say hi, just the word hi. And then a venture capitalist would fund it for an extraordinary amount of money. And then the thing itself would never be made. Like that's what the NHS Responders app was. It was a sign-up sheet to nothing. Like no one has got anything done through that app, basically. It's got to have a tiny number of requests, whereas the mutual aid groups actually work. Like, on mine, 5 things have happened today before 7 p.m. Like, and that just covers like 3 roads near my house. So I think what they have shown up is not a kind of left-wing impulse, but it is that the state will not save you, but your neighbours might, and your neighbours might be Tories. We don't know.
I think on that note, on our neighbours might be Tories, I might call an end to it. This was a really, really good discussion. Thank you both. I've definitely actually learned a lot more, and it was really useful to rethink this, the community survival programs, the Black Panthers and their relevance today, because one of the ways that my early moments of thinking through what was possible was actually learning about the community survival program, specifically the education program. Erica Huggins was watching one of my lectures talking about the way they approached education within these programs. And I do agree with you, Sita, that they're like very different from what mutual aid tends to be. Also, one other thing that you said was that they were trying to, within those, within our such projects that we might want to achieve, which are within the communities, we're actively engaging in a creative process with the people, as opposed to just going in and we'll teach you how to be good, how to act politically, and we'll feed you and then you can watch a little lefty film. I don't think that is a good approach, and I think it requires some like letting go of power. So
this is the classic question. Look, I've been doing a lot of these talks recently, and people turn up and they get really annoyed. They like come in and they're like, okay, so this is an anti-racist movement, but why doesn't it talk about the global commodity chain? Right? Like, so they tore down the statue. Why aren't they now going down, taking down the corporation? Right? And normally this is said by really well-meaning left-wing people, right? And you're like, okay, dude, but it doesn't work like that, right? Like when the 19-year-old, when the man came down from the hood, and I know this because I know people that went and beat the fascists up 2 weeks ago. Some people just rolled out of bed and were like, hold on, they're in London Centre, we're going down there to smack them up, right? That was hours after they were there. Movements won't work that way. You can't just go, you can't just create a cut out version of the proletariat. And I think part of the Panthers' work and Cedric Robinson's work has always been about destabilizing who the agent of history is going to be, what they're going to look like, what they're going to think, and necessarily the contradictions you'll have to deal with in trying to push people who are, against police brutality, against the cuts to austerity, towards maybe horizons that necessarily they're not ready for just yet. They will get there, but you have to work with them and their problems in order to say, well, underpinning all of this is racial capitalism. Because it means nothing to tell someone, oh, it's racial capitalism that's oppressing you. I mean, it means everything and nothing, right? At the same time, doesn't it? Like, it means everything and it means nothing. So I feel like that's the key lesson I learned from the Panthers, is to work with people's issues in order that you can uplift each other towards a better horizon.
Brilliant. Yeah, again, thank you everyone for joining. The last thing I want to clarify is that the person who asked the question about the Black Panther community organizing was not suggesting that mutual aid groups are going to be these like revolutionary spaces, and was also not suggesting we go and play films. So within those spaces. So yeah, again, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Sita. Thank you, John. I'm going to end the call now.
Cool. Take care, everyone.
Bye.